Great. Okay, so first let me introduce myself. My name's Mary Cousins. I'm the Regulatory Program Manager for BACWA. And my presentation today is going to be based on my experience working at BACWA for the past 2 years, and then also based on my experience before that, helping wastewater agencies around Northern California with their NPDES permit reissuances, which I did as a consultant. Most of that work was in the San Francisco Bay region, but also a few other regions. And most of you know that I help out with all kinds of BACWA committee work and reviewing new regulations, but I'm also available to always answer your questions about your permit if you would like, so please just reach out to me directly. Having said that, I always encourage you to reach out directly to your permit case handler, your permit writer at the regional board too, if you have questions, because they're really the authority on this issue, and they're very friendly and open to helping as well. So an outline of my talk today is that first I'm going to be providing sort of a general background about the regulations that are underlying your NPDES permit. So I'll go through that first, and then I'll talk about beneficial uses and basin plans, which are our local planning documents that support what's in your permit. After that regulatory background, then I'm going to go into the actual contents of what's in your permit, and then I'll wrap up at the end talking about the permit reissuance process. And I have built in a couple of breaks in the slide deck so that we can pause and ask questions. So my hope is today that you'll leave here with a better understanding of what requirements are actually in your permit, maybe understand why your permit might be the same or different from other permits around the state or your neighboring agency. And then hopefully you can use this knowledge as you interpret your permit day to day and also when you're in a permit reissuance process. So first I want to begin with a bit of regulatory background. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, there was a growing awareness about the environmental effects of wastewater. Now, we knew from the previous era in the 19th and earliest 20th century what the public health threats of wastewater were with respect to pathogens, but the control of wastewater discharge didn't really extend beyond pathogen control early on. So it was really this founding legislation in California, the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, that introduced the modern era of environmental control of wastewater discharge. And this is also the legislation that kind of gave us the bureaucracy that we have today. The 9 regional water boards actually date back to 1949, but it was this legislation from 1969 that really empowered them to start taking more action with permitting and so on. And need to advance the slide. Each of the 9 regional boards has 7 members, and they're each appointed by the governor. And each of these 9 regional boards has a particular focus to it. So for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Bay is really at the heart of a lot of the actions of the regional board. In other regions, for example, in Region 1, there's a lot of focus on forestry operations, and in Region 5, there's a lot of focus on agricultural operations and so on. So they're all structured a little bit differently, and they all operate independently. Now, the Porter-Cologne Act was recognized as really strong anti-pollution legislation, and so at the federal level, it was a model, and it was used as a model for the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was adopted by Congress in 1972, so we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act this year. And the Clean Water Act, of course, is what set up NPDES permitting. So it's really central to the whole permitting process. It set up many programs that we're still really using today. It requires the states to adopt water quality standards, and I'm going to go into that a lot today. It also sets up the process for listing certain water bodies that don't meet those standards as impaired. That's the 303D list. And it sets up the total maximum daily load program to bring those water bodies back into compliance. And it also set up a funding mechanism through the state revolving funds, and initially provided a lot of funding for agencies to install secondary treatment. Now, the Clean Water Act has a key difference from the Porter-Cologne Act because it does not cover groundwater. It only covers surface waters of the United States, whereas the Porter-Cologne Act covered both surface water and groundwater, which is a water of the state. The final piece of regulatory background I wanted to mention today is anti-degradation policy. And this is not a piece of legislation. It's really more of a philosophy that underlies Clean Water Act, Porter-Cologne Act, and all of the permitting that the regional board does. And it really just says that the job of the regulatory authority is to protect water quality. And so if there's a discharge that's proposed, it's really incumbent on the discharger to demonstrate whether there's going to be degradation of water quality as a result of that discharge. And if so, it's only permissible if there's really a compelling social reason to allow that discharge. So this is the kind of rule that can get invoked kind of at any time to protect water quality. So I talked about the Porter-Cologne Act and the Clean Water Act, and those are both pieces of legislation that regulate the discharge of wastewater, viewing it through the lens of it being a waste. And so that has a big influence on where your wastewater goes and the quality of the discharge. But there's also a separate regulatory bodies that regulate wastewater in terms of it being a resource, or for supporting our water resources in the state. And so the State Water Board has separate divisions that are in charge of surface water rights and establishing water recycling criteria, both non-potable and then coming soon potable reuse, as well as another completely separate state department, the Department of Water Resources, which runs various groundwater management programs and integrated regional water management to encourage the responsible use of water resources. All of these programs also do influence whether your wastewater is treated to a certain standard and perhaps reused for some other purpose. So I just wanted to mention those programs too, because again, there's not just NPDES permitting that's kind of going to determine how your plant is designed and operated. It's these other considerations as well. I want to talk a little bit about the state and regional water boards. The regional water board is the agency that's going to be issuing your NPDES permit in most cases. But it's important to understand how their responsibilities differ from the State Water Board. The State Water Board has a water quality division, but it's really in charge of setting policy that's used throughout the state, establishing water quality objectives if they apply around the state. The State Water Board also has water rights responsibilities, as well as a financial assistance division. The regional water boards, again, they operate completely independently of the State Water Board, even though they do receive guidance from the State Water Board. Day to day, it's a separate operation, and they have many more separate divisions, focusing on the actual issuing of permits for wastewater and stormwater and groundwater cleanup, as well as an enforcement division. Now, the EPA also has a role to play, but it's more limited. They still maintain oversight and review of all NPDES permits. In California, the program has been delegated from EPA down to the state, but EPA maintains that oversight role. EPA also has oversight over the federal pretreatment program, although California, again, is delegated authority to run the program, and the State Water Board has recently added staff in that area. The EPA is also in charge of issuing tribal discharge permits, and there are 6 of those in the state of California for NPDES permits. And then they work with the regional boards to jointly issue NPDES permits for discharge into federal waters. The authority of the state of California for permitting only extends 3 nautical miles offshore. So, for example, this picture is of the San Francisco's outfall, which is more than 3 miles offshore, and so the EPA is involved in that, issuing that permit. So these are not the only ways that EPA can get involved, but the most likely way you would ever see EPA involved directly in your permit would be to perhaps write a comment letter on a permit reissuance, and they do that only when perhaps there's some policy statement that they're trying to make that affects more than one permit. They don't tend to sort of micromanage the permitting process. So before I move on, I wanted to just take a moment to talk about what NPDES permits I'm going to be focusing on today, and then how those compare to other kinds of permits you might have. I talked about the Clean Water Act and Porter-Cologne Act. If you have a NPDES permit, that is specifically going to be for discharge to surface water bodies. If you're discharging your wastewater and it only goes to land and it reaches perhaps groundwater, but isn't going to be reaching any kind of surface water, then that is handled through a separate state program called Waste Discharge Requirements, or a WDR. And those are authorized under the Porter-Cologne Act. They are also issued by the regional water boards. They are typically, but not always, handled by a separate division within the regional water board that is focused on protecting groundwater quality. And so it may be different staff. It's a separate permitting program, but there are similarities in terms of having discharge requirements and monitoring requirements and so on. A key difference between these two is that NPDES permits expire every 5 years. That's a requirement of the Clean Water Act, whereas waste discharge requirements do not expire. Now, your NPDES permits can be like a discharger-specific permit that lists only your agency as the permittee. There are also regional permits where multiple permittees are listed right on the permit. We have a couple of these in Region 2. For example, we have a municipal permit, regional permit for stormwater, where all the different stormwater agencies are listed right on the front. We also have a Mercury and PCB's watershed permit that lists all the different wastewater agencies in the Bay Area. And then there's requirements that apply to all of them. There's also something called a general permit, where the permit's prepared ahead of time by the regional or state board, and then you enroll in it. So you basically say, look, I meet all the requirements of this permit. I'm trying to do this discharge that a lot of other people do too, and it's similar around the state, and it just lists all the requirements that you need to do to enroll. You basically submit what's called a notice of intent to enroll in the order. And an example of that is that there's a statewide drinking water permit for drinking water systems to discharge, for fire testing and things like that. On the waste discharge requirement side, there's a similar hierarchy. There are specific WDRs that list a specific enrollee. Many Central Valley wastewater treatment plants that don't discharge to a surface water body and only to groundwater, for example, operate under a WDR. I don't know of any regional WDRs, although they may be out there. There are many, many general WDRs that you can enroll in. For example, there's the statewide WDR for sanitary sewer systems that regulates the reporting of overflows. All of the construction and small MS4 stormwater permits also operate this way. And then many of the regional boards have like specific WDRs you can enroll in, like for dairies and wineries and so on. I'm not going to be talking about any of those WDRs today. Just wanted to establish like what the differences are. Okay, basin plans and beneficial uses. So I talked about the 9 regional water boards around the state. Each of them maintains a master planning document that is called a basin plan. And it's basically contains all of the policies and water quality standards and so on that are specific to that region. These documents have to be kept updated. You will easily find them on the Regional Water Board's website for whatever region you're in. And they are reviewed every 3 years in a process called the triennial review process that identifies like what are the high priority policy changes and then allocates staff time for making those changes. Within these basin plans, there's some very important designations that happen in the basin plan. And what they do is they designate beneficial uses for all of the water bodies in that region. It actually has a list of all the water bodies and says basically what can those water bodies be used for, all the surface waters and all the groundwater basins. These documents also identify what are the water quality objectives that are going to protect those beneficial uses. So I'm going to give some examples to make this more clear. Examples of beneficial uses are things like drinking water, which is called the municipal beneficial use, using water for agricultural irrigation, for water contact recreation, or all different kinds of habitat, whether it's freshwater or saltwater habitat. And they each have this little like acronym that or abbreviation that goes with them as well. So on the bottom of this slide, this is just a clip out of the Central Coast Basin Plan, just to show you an example. There's this big table of all of the different water bodies in the Central Coast region. I just picked this example at random. Here's Corralitos Lagoon. This is a picture of it on the top, and you can see it's listed in the basin plan as supporting Rec 1, which is water contact recreation like swimming, Rec 2, which means non-contact recreation like being out in a boat, for example, wildlife habitat and cold freshwater habitat, and then commercial and sport fishing. So when the Regional Water Board considers what the water quality objectives are for this water body, then they are going to be considering those beneficial uses. So this linkage is what's established right within the basin plan. Each beneficial use is supposed to be associated with a water quality objective. So, for example, if you're protecting the drinking water beneficial use, that means that drinking water limits are typically going to apply as water quality objectives. If you're protecting an agricultural supply beneficial use, then you want to have water quality objectives for things like salinity and minerals, because those are the constituents that could harm plants. If you're protecting the beneficial use of water contact recreation, it's things like bacteria that are the applicable water quality objective. And for protecting cold freshwater habitat, fish are more sensitive to items like dissolved oxygen and temperature, as well as metals and other constituents too. In addition to the 9 regional water boards, each having their own basin plan, there's an ocean plan that's adopted by the State Water Board. And this is also updated every 3 years. It's a bit more simple than the basin plans because the ocean doesn't have a lot of different beneficial uses. It just has really 2, marine aquatic life and water contact recreation. And it lists all of the objectives right within this ocean plan. And it also has the implementation procedures for how those objectives get used in permits. So it's kind of a very nice one document that can be used if you have a permit for ocean discharge. All right, I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions at this point. If you could put your question in the chat or raise your hand, and I can see it either way. All right, I'm going to go on because I don't see any. Oop. When did the regional board membership change? Each regional board member is, I believe, appointed for a 2-year term, and then they can be reappointed. And they are updated all the time. We just got a new regional water board member within our region within the last 2 weeks. So we're finally back up to 7 members in our region. So those appointments often happen at different times of year because regional water board members may have to drop out for one reason or another. So I think you really pretty much just have to check the regional board's website to see who the current members are. Didn't it used to be 9? Oh, how? I don't know the answer to that. There's a question, between NPDES and WDR permits, is one more restrictive than the other? The main difference between them, between WDR and NPDES permits, besides the fact that NPDES permits expire every 5 years, that's a key difference. WDRs are not subject to third-party lawsuits the way that NPDES permits are. That's a feature of the Clean Water Act, and that is not a part of the WDR program. The actual effluent limits that are contained within the permits, there's not one type of permit that's more restrictive than another. It really is just based on what water body you're discharging to, and the region that you're in, and all those kinds of considerations. And then there's a question, can you verify when does EPA oversee NPDES permitting? Is it when it exceeds the 3-mile outfall? When it's more than 3 miles offshore, then the EPA is the lead agency for issuing the NPDES permit. But they usually do work with the regional boards as well, because there's all different kinds of operational criteria that also go into preparing the permit. So they'll usually involve the regional board too, but it's the EPA that's the lead agency. Any other questions before I move on? We can always go back to. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to talking about what's actually in your permit, rather than the regulatory background. And if you want to go ahead and pull up a permit that you work with, hard copy or electronic copy, I think that would be useful as we go along. So I'm going to talk about the different sections of the permit. So each permit starts out with prohibitions. I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. It has effluent limitations, receiving water limits, provisions, and then a bunch of attachments, including definitions, maps, diagrams, federal standard provisions, and then monitoring and reporting program. So I'll talk mostly about attachment E, a little bit about D, and not really A, B, or C. So starting with the prohibitions, this is on the outline. There are some basic prohibitions that are going to be right at the beginning of each and every NPDES permit. And basically these are like, don't discharge wastewater except as described in this order. So it basically says you can't change where your wastewater is going, for example, because the permit itself says, here's where your outfall is, the geographic coordinates of the outfall, and that's part of the permit. There's also a prohibition that you can't bypass your treatment train, although there's exceptions as that are described in attachment D of your permit, which I'll get to. You can't discharge untreated wastewater. So real basic stuff is what's in the prohibitions. In addition to those basic prohibitions, there's also going to be specific prohibitions that are specifically tailored for your facility. And typically these are going to be for things like flow, dilution, and your discharge dates. So for example, you might see a prohibition on dry weather flow. I'm going to provide examples from different permits around the state. Here's one that has a dry weather flow prohibition based on the average dry weather flow. You might see a prohibition based on dilution conditions in the receiving water. And these can look a lot of different ways depending on where you are in the state. For example, here there's a discharge to the Feather River, and it's based on the height of the river flow. There's another example here where the prohibition is based on a ratio of the effluent to the river flow. And then finally, here's an example of a discharge prohibition that's based on dilution in the receiving water based on a modeling study, because it's kind of difficult to actually measure dilution within San Francisco Bay in the field. Finally, some permits, but not all, have some sort of seasonal discharge window listed right in the prohibitions at the beginning of the permit. May say, discharge is only allowed for a certain part of the year. So basically, the prohibitions are setting up very basic parameters of what's in your permit. Like, what can you discharge? When can you discharge it? That kind of stuff. The next part of the permit after prohibitions is going to be the effluent limitations. There are two basic kinds of effluent limits, and these are derived from the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act itself says permits can have technology-based effluent limits or water quality-based effluent limits. These have different goals. The goals of the technology-based effluent limits is to really broadly limit the discharge of pollutants into waters of the United States. On the other hand, the water quality-based effluent limits are really designed to actually protect a specific receiving water. The technology-based effluent limits are actually required to be in your permit by the Clean Water Act. It's basically the secondary treatment standards. However, the regional board also has the authority to make those limits more stringent than required by the Clean Water Act, if that treatment is necessary or if it's already been installed at the plant. The water quality-based effluent limits are not required except for pollutants that have reasonable potential to exceed a water quality objective. I will talk about this in more detail. The important thing to know about your water quality-based effluent limits is that they are unique for each discharger and each receiving water pair. So you're not going to have the same effluent limitations in most cases as another agency in your region if you're talking about water quality-based effluent limits. So some examples of technology-based effluent limits, BOD and TSS and pH are what you're going to have technology-based effluent limits for. The federal requirement, the minimum is this 30 milligrams per liter for average monthly, 45 milligrams per liter average weekly. So in the bottom right, that's an example of a permit that has those federal secondary treatment limits in it. And then sometimes permits can be substituted, carbonaceous BOD for regular BOD, and you see that on this lower left-hand example. And then sometimes plants, they do have lower, are capable of meeting lower limits. For example, if they have filtration installed or tertiary treatment, and in those cases, the technology-based effluent limits are going to be lower because the technology at the plant is capable of meeting those lower limits. Water quality-based effluent limits are much more complicated than technology-based limits. So there's a lot of factors that go into setting them. And these are just some of them. I like to think of it as making a stew. So these are all the ingredients going in. That was my concept here. So the main ingredients are the effluent quality, the receiving water quality, and then what is the water quality objective that is required to protect the beneficial use of the receiving water. There's all these other factors too, like translators and dilution factors and averaging periods that also go into it. And I will talk about this a little bit more. So here's some examples. In terms of water quality objectives, let me first provide some background. Most water quality objectives are numeric water quality objectives. So it's a number. It's a number that's associated with a specific pollutant. So perhaps it's a metal and the objective is, so and so many milligrams per liter. It's a numeric criteria for a specific chemical. Again, most water quality objectives, when you think of them, are numeric criteria and they are for specific chemicals. So that's kind of the classic example. So for example, you may have water quality objectives to protect the beneficial use of aquatic life. And then there's all different averaging periods that can be associated with that, acute or chronic averaging periods. It may be to protect freshwater or saltwater organisms. So the number of water quality objectives that can potentially apply to a discharge, there's a lot of them. These are hundreds of pollutants, and each of them has different objectives to protect different beneficial uses. Human health is another beneficial use that needs to be protected. If there's a recreational beneficial use or a drinking water beneficial use, or if people are eating fish and shellfish from a water body, those are all fall under the umbrella of human health water quality objectives. And there's lists of those too. And the most common resource document that's going to contain these is the California Toxics Rule, which I'll talk about in a minute. Not all water quality objectives are necessarily for specific pollutants. So there are also over here on the right-hand side, there's numeric criteria that apply, but they're not for specific pollutants. They're for effects in the water body. So for example, whole effluent toxicity, it is numeric. Um, Even now with the toxicity unit approach, that's somewhat numeric, and then the TST approach that's coming soon in California is even more numeric and statistical in its approach. But it's not, for one specific chemical, it's for all toxicity. There's also biological criteria where you're like looking at an effect in the receiving water. For example, how many macroinvertebrates are there growing in your receiving water? And these are also numeric criteria, but again, they're not for a specific chemical. So in addition to the numeric criteria, there's also narrative water quality objectives. And these also protect beneficial uses, but they're just sentences that you're going to find in the basin plan. So statements like, all waters shall be free of toxic substances. Or also, waters shall be free of coloration that causes nuisance. These are still objectives just as much as a number is an objective, but they just don't have a number associated with them. And sometimes the regional board has to be creative in how it implements these objectives within your permit. Finding which water quality objectives apply to your discharge, it's a huge amount of work, and it's tricky to do, and that's one of the main jobs of the Regional Water Board, to prepare a new NPDES permit. Now, having said that, most people are not changing where their discharge point is, and so the objectives for you, for your discharge, are not going to really change much permit to permit. They're going to carry over, and they should be listed right within your NPDES permit. So most of us are not in the position of needing to figure this out. But if you wanted to go and figure out where the objectives in your permit came from, it can be quite complex. There's all these different resource documents. One of the main ones would be drinking water regulations if you're discharging to a water body that's used for drinking water. Another big one is the California Toxics Rule, which is a regulation that was adopted by the EPA. So it's actually a federal action, but it's called the California Toxics Rule because they adopted it on behalf of the state of California as required by the Clean Water Act. The California Ocean Plan also has water quality objectives listed in it. And if you're an ocean discharger, this is the document that you would be finding all of your objectives listed in. And then the basin plans themselves also have any kind of site-specific objective that applies to a water body in your region that might be different from the California Toxics Rule or drinking water regulations. It might be for additional constituents, or it may be lower or higher than the default that are listed in these other reference documents. Generally speaking, the most stringent objective from all these different resource documents is going to apply. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of how water quality objectives from those different resource documents might be showing up in your permit as a water quality based effluent limit. So here's a couple examples of drinking water MCLs that got used as effluent limits. The most common one around the state is nitrate, because there's a drinking water MCL for nitrate. So here's an example at the top where there's a monthly and weekly effluent limits for nitrate. Also at the bottom, a different example. And they're different because, as I'll explain, the water quality objective doesn't just get copied right into your permit as a limit. There's adjustments that need to be made for the background concentration and for the variability of your effluent data, and there may be dilution in the receiving water. So that's why the average weekly limits for these two dischargers vary. You also have things like salts that can show up as a water quality-based effluent limit in order to protect the beneficial use of drinking water so that it's not high in salinity. Here's a few examples of the California Toxics Rule getting implemented as water quality-based effluent limits. The California Toxics Rule has, like I said, many objectives listed in it, but they're broken into categories. There's objectives to protect human health, and those are based on drinking water as well as eating organisms that grow in the water, fish and shellfish. And then there's a bunch of objectives for protecting aquatic life, freshwater and saltwater aquatic life as well. So for example, here at the top, you see a permit that has limits for 2 disinfection byproducts, and these are based on protecting human health for drinking water. So whatever receiving water is being discharged to for this permit, it's being potentially used for drinking water. This middle example is for a constituent, cyanide, that has a CTR objective to protect freshwater aquatic life. And then at the bottom here, there's a permit that has a limit for heptachlor, and that limit was based on the need to protect human health for consumption of fish and shellfish from this receiving water. And then finally, here's a few examples of permits that have effluent limits based on either basin plan or an ocean plan criteria. So, like I said before, the ocean plan is much more straightforward. So the sources of the objectives and how they're turned into limits is not so mysterious. But this is just an example showing some limits that are intended to protect marine aquatic life based out of the ocean plan. And then on the right-hand side here is some limits for a Central Valley discharger that are based on some pesticide objectives that are in the Central Valley Basin Plan. And then here at the bottom is an example from the San Francisco Bay Regional Basin Plan, which has regional specific limits for ammonia and chlorine, as well as site-specific objectives for copper and cyanide. So all of those are showing up in this permit. Many permits contain a summary table in the fact sheet that explains all of the different objectives that were used in order to establish the water quality-based effluent limits in that permit. This is a wonderful resource to have in your permit because first of all, it explains what beneficial uses you're protecting with each of your limits. And then if there's any kind of adjustment that's ever needed, it's much more obvious of how that adjustment would actually happen. For example, if there's a change in one of the water quality objectives, you could see, well, is it actually lower than the objective already listed in my permit? Am I actually going to be impacted by this change? And if you don't have one of these summary tables in your permit, it's something that you could always ask your regional water board permit writer to include. So we talked about the water quality objectives part of establishing water quality-based effluent limits. So now I'm going to talk about the effluent quality and receiving water quality part of the soup here. And the process for considering these three all together is called the reasonable potential analysis. And this is where you ask, does this discharge actually have reasonable potential to cause an exceedance of a water quality objective that has been established to protect a beneficial use? And if the answer is yes to that question, then you're going to need a water quality-based effluent limit. If the answer is no to that question, you don't need to have an effluent limit for that pollutant. And there's more than 100 different pollutants that are considered as part of this reasonable potential analysis. Most of you, not all, but most of you don't have effluent limits for hundreds of pollutants in your permit. And that's because in most cases, the answer to this reasonable potential analysis is no. As if your effluent and your receiving water are already both lower than the water quality objective, then you don't need an effluent limit. And if the receiving water is already exceeding the objective, which means it's an impaired receiving water, it's not meeting the objective, you also don't need a limit if that constituent has not been detected in your effluent. The scenarios where you do need a water quality-based effluent limit are when your effluent exceeds the water quality objective. That's the most common scenario that triggers the need for an effluent limit. Another scenario might be where both the effluent and the receiving water are exceeding the objective, or the receiving water is impaired for that pollutant, and that pollutant is found within your effluent limit, because that means that the receiving water is already impaired and you have the potential to make it worse. So in all of these three cases, you do need an effluent limit. Now, this procedure that I just walked through is listed in this guidance document called the State Implementation Policy for toxic standards for inland surface waters, enclosed bays, and estuaries. Nobody calls it that long title. They call it the SIP, or State Implementation Policy. And it has these step-by-step procedures for conducting the reasonable potential analysis, and it applies to any kind of toxic pollutant. And if you're an inland discharger, so if you're not discharging to the ocean, then this is the guidance document that the regional board is going to be using to conduct that reasonable potential analysis. So they don't really have a lot of flexibility in terms of whether they determine an effluent limit is needed based on your data, because the SIP says exactly what procedures they have to carry out to make that determination. Again, it only applies to toxics, to priority pollutants. It doesn't apply to some additional pollutants like nutrients, for example. There are some additional guidance documents that are similar to the SIP. One of them is the Ocean Plan, which I talked about. It contains all the procedures for setting effluent limits for ocean dischargers. It uses a process similar to what I just showed in terms of determining reasonable potential, but it uses it's a little bit different. There's a statistical projection involved for your effluent data, and it also assumes dilution as part of the analysis on the front end. The EPA technical support document from 1991 is also still used. It's similar to the procedures in the Ocean Plan, and again, it's a little bit more complex than what's in the SIP. The SIP does not allow considering of dilution on the front end. So I want to just walk through a quick example of how a water quality objective gets turned into an effluent limit. This is a procedure that happens in they're going to use an Excel spreadsheet to make a bunch of statistical adjustments to translate an objective into an effluent limit. You can request a copy of that spreadsheet from your regional board if you want to see all the formulas, and usually it's also pasted into your permit. I'm not going to go through the details of that calculation. I just want you to understand, like, holistically what's going on. So first, this is just an example. Each water body has beneficial uses. So for this example, for San Francisco Bay is used for fishing. People eat organisms out of San Francisco Bay. So human health objectives for consumption of organisms apply to San Francisco Bay because of that fishery beneficial use. That means that there are specific water quality objectives from the CTR, California Toxics Rule, that apply to that water body. So as an example, there's an objective for bis-2 ethyl hexyl phthalate, which is a plasticizer, and that objective is 5.9 micrograms per liter. Now, in this example, a discharger actually had taken several effluent samples for this constituent, and the maximum concentration was 6.2. That exceeds the objective of 5.9. So we talked about the reasonable potential analysis. This discharge has the potential to cause an exceedance of the objective because the effluent concentration is higher than the objective. And that means that there has to be a limit for this pollutant within this specific permit because it's specific to this discharger. In this example, the discharger received an effluent limit of 53 micrograms per liter because a dilution credit of 10-1 was incorporated because they have a deep water outfall into San Francisco Bay. Now this limit is going to stay in the permit to permit term until one of a few things happens. One thing that can happen is that at the next permit reissuance, the maximum concentration that was observed during the previous permit term from the various samples that were collected of effluent, perhaps all of those samples were lower than the objective. In that case, the limit can be removed because the reasonable potential analysis is conducted at each permit reissuance. Another thing that could happen is the dilution factor perhaps could increase. Now, it couldn't have increased for this discharger because 10-1 is the maximum that our regional board will grant for cyanide. But for other constituents, for example, for ammonia, let's say the discharger decided to move their outfall and build a different outfall that has more dilution available. In theory, then, the next time that the permit's reissued, then the effluent limit for that constituent could go up. Both of these scenarios are like new information that would be available when the permit's reissued that could result in a change in the limit. However, in general, there are these two concepts that are going to apply, anti-degradation and anti-backsliding, that are important to consider because they kind of work with the framework for setting effluent limits that I described. There's the whole sort of mathematical framework for turning objectives into effluent limits. These are sort of like the additional considerations that can also affect the limits in your permit. So anti-degradation is, that's that underlying philosophy behind the Clean Water Act and Porter-Cologne, where the regional board is protecting water quality from becoming degraded. So if you're planning to change anything about your discharge in terms of increasing the concentration in your effluent or the flow rate or the mass of pollutants discharged, then anti-degradation policy is going to come into consideration. Anti-backsliding is a similar concept, but it's really permit specific. And it's this concept that your effluent limits are always going to be as stringent as they were in your last permit, unless there's some new reason that will allow the limits to change, such as your water quality data, an objective or other regulation changing, or maybe you have a new dilution study or something like that, like a technical reason why a change should be allowed. You need to do an anti-degradation analysis anytime that you're going to have an increase in flow or a new outfall location, or if you need higher effluent limits for a reason like having an RO concentrate return stream, or perhaps a new biosolids process that's going to have a return stream. Having submitted an anti-degradation analysis would be a justification for the regional board to change your effluent limits. Anti-backsliding allows there's an exception for anti-backsliding where the regional board can remove effluent limits if there's no reasonable potential when a permit's reissued. And like I said, otherwise effluent limits tend to be retained from permit to permit, and they can be retained in order to ensure that your plant continues to perform as designed. So I talked about sections of your permit, the prohibitions and the effluent limitations, focusing on water quality-based effluent limits. So I'm going to do a break for Q&A on those topics. So I'm going to switch over here to the chat. And I see, how often is the CTR updated? Typically, if the CTR itself is not updated, but the EPA can adopt new water quality criteria that apply in California or throughout the nation. And when they do that, it's usually a very long process because it's often put out for a draft review. The EPA has like a water quality objectives page, and they list different objectives that maybe they're working on from time to time. They were working on selenium recently, for example. This is something that we try to track at BACWA, and CASA will tend to track it. So if there's any kind of change, that dischargers can know about it. A more common change than the objectives themselves is also like the implementation of the objectives, like how they're used within permits. And the state board is working on a process right now for how metals objectives are used, for example. Now, the EPA is also sometimes sets drinking water objectives. Those are not part of the CTR, but those are also potentially affecting NPDES permits for inland dischargers because the drinking water objective is based on drinking water MCLs. So for example, right now, PFAS drinking water MCLs are going to be developed soon, most likely, and those could be the type of limits that eventually make their way into NPDES permits. So there isn't like there isn't one place that objectives come from, and so changes in objectives could come from the regional board, the state board, or the EPA. There's a question of, for dilution limits, how is the flow determined? And do we need to have a stream gauge upstream? Every permit and every regional board is different in terms of how dilution is considered. If it's an inland water body like a river, it's typically the case that there's some kind of gauge somewhere, but whether it's a stage gauge or whether there's a flow rate, it's all very site specific. So I would encourage you to talk with a regional water board member from your region to figure out how that works in your region, and to look for other example permits if there are any for that water body. And then there's a question of, when the spreadsheet formulas are being used for setting the water quality limits, is the MCL used or the average concentration used during sampling? I think the question might be related to effluent water quality. Both are used, both the maximum and the average are used. The maximum is used to determine whether or not, the maximum effluent concentration that you've observed during the last 5 years or last few years if you're doing a permit reissuance, the maximum effluent concentration is what's used to determine if you have reasonable potential, in which case you need an effluent limit. Once that determination's made, the effluent data is also used to assess variability, and the variability of the data is one of the statistical adjustments that goes into setting the effluent limit. It's not so much the average that's used, it's the coefficient of variability that's used to set the effluent limit. But that's like a secondary factor after the determination about reasonable potential has been made. Who appoints the regional board members is a question, and it's the governor that does that. Behind the scenes, I don't know. Beyond that, that's who's officially in charge. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm going to go on. Good news is we're through the most difficult technical content. Now I want to talk about receiving water limits. So we already talked about effluent limits that apply to your actual effluent, but your permit also contains receiving water limits that basically say what kind of condition can you cause in the receiving water. And unlike the effluent limits where there's all these like statistical changes, a bunch of math tied up into the calculation of the effluent limits, receiving water limits tend to be like really closely tied to actual objectives that are in the basin plan. So here's an example of the kind of really generic language that you might see in a permit, which is basically just saying you can't cause an exceedance of a water quality objective because those are needed to protect beneficial uses. Receiving water limits, unlike effluent limits, they're not necessarily tied to a real frequent monitoring regime. So the limits are there, but you may not actually have a requirement in your permit to show compliance with those objectives very frequently. It may be infrequent. However, there are exceptions to that. For example, for really sensitive end uses like beach use, especially in Southern California, you may have bacteria monitoring required fairly frequently, or if it's a discharge to a very sensitive habitat, there may be like dissolved oxygen monitoring needed on a more frequent time scale to show that you're not causing some sort of critical receiving water problem. But generally, the way the permits are structured, it's supposed to be, in most cases, frequent effluent monitoring that is going to ensure that you protect the receiving water. It's not receiving water monitoring that is meant to ensure you protect the receiving water. The receiving water monitoring is usually more like a backup to make sure, okay, we got this right, rather than like a routine compliance situation. Okay, so moving on from receiving water limits. The next section of your permit is going to be called the provisions. Now, a lot of the standard provisions are actually not in the main front part of your permit. They are often, at least in our region, in attachment D. And this has some really basic standard federal provisions that come right out of the Clean Water Act. And these are, in some cases, just so foundational that you may kind of overlook them. It's items like you have a duty to comply. You must comply with this permit. A duty to mitigate. If there's some kind of problem, you need to try to fix it. And you have to properly operate and maintain your treatment plant. You have to allow inspections by the regional board. You have to keep records and certify your monitoring results. All of that stuff's in attachment D. It is a useful reference, especially if there is a need for you to bypass any part of your treatment plant or if there's an upset. To my mind, those would be the main reasons why you're diving into attachment D. Attachment D has, again, the federal standard provisions which contain the requirements for notifying the board if there's a bypass situation. And that might be because of an emergency, or if you have some kind of planned construction project where you need to bypass a part of your treatment plant or some part of your outfall infrastructure. You're going to want to read that language, and then you're probably going to want to directly contact your case handler as well, because frankly, the language in the permit is not that easy to interpret. So in addition to the standard provisions, that again, they come from the Clean Water Act and they're usually in attachment D, there's also like specific provisions that apply to your treatment plant that are going to be in the front section of the permit. These provisions are often similar from plant to plant. And in fact, in Region 2, we have an additional attachment called regional standard provisions that's found at the end of the permit, attachment G. Not every region uses that approach, but generally the provisions are going to cover things like monitoring and reporting. So it'll say like you need to do monitoring and reporting as described in the permit. There's often a provision requiring you to implement your pre-treatment program if you have one. There may be provisions related to operations and maintenance of your plant. It might be generic, or it might be like a specific plan that the regional board wants to have you submit. There may be pollution prevention requirements. This is a standard within the San Francisco Bay region. And there may be provisions related to biosolids requiring that you comply with federal rules, and then there may be some additional requirements as well. And then one item that we're seeing added to some permits in Southern California is a provision related to climate change adaptation planning. Not all permits around the state have this yet, but it's probably safe to assume that it's coming. So that's the end of the provisions. So I talked about prohibitions, effluent limits, receiving water limits, and provisions. Those are the main sections of the front part of your permit, the legally enforceable part of your permit. So now I'm going to switch over to talking about one of the attachments. This is the monitoring and reporting program. It's usually attachment E. And this is going to have all different kinds of monitoring requirements, just absolutely a hodgepodge. And for many of you, this might be the part that you interact with the most because it's more of the day-to-day requirements. There's often influent and effluent monitoring required. You have to have influent and effluent to show compliance with the federal secondary treatment standards. And you often need to have flow monitoring required to show that you've complied with your dry weather flow limitation. There's often whole effluent toxicity testing, and that's required for compliance. There may be other types of monitoring related to process control, like a regional board may require UV disinfection monitoring or storage pond operation. There's a recycled water monitoring is being added to a lot of permits to reflect the state water board's requirement for volumetric annual reporting of recycled water. That's the approach used by our region. And then there may be biosolids monitoring required, both for disposal and then also for pretreatment program reasons. And then the last type of monitoring would be receiving water monitoring. Now, I know not all of you are from the San Francisco Bay region, but I wanted to just stop for a moment to talk about the regional monitoring program, because in our region, most dischargers in the San Francisco Bay region don't have receiving water monitoring. And instead, what they have is a statement that you have to continue to participate in the regional monitoring program, which is been around since 1992, and it's run out of the San Francisco Estuary Institute. The regional monitoring program, it has a budget of about $4 million a year, and about half of that comes from municipal wastewater dischargers in the Bay Area. And the data that the regional monitoring program collects is used to fulfill all of the purposes that individual monitoring could fulfill. It just does it a bit more efficiently. So this data can be used to determine if the bay is meeting water quality objectives, or if not, if it's impaired and a 303D listing is required. It can be used to evaluate compliance with receiving water limits. So I talked about how your permit's going to contain a section that says you must maintain the receiving water to be in compliance with water quality objectives. This is the way you would evaluate that if you're a bay discharger. RMP data can also be used to provide background concentrations that are used to develop water quality-based effluent limits if there's dilution credits. And then also to provide like the background pH, temperature, salinity, and other basic parameters that are required for implementing water quality objectives for ammonia and for metals, because there's adjustments needed for hardness or temperature and so on. Now, if you're not in Region 2 and if you're instead a discharger elsewhere in the state and you don't have the benefit of a regional monitoring program, then you're going to have to collect receiving water samples yourself for these same uses. Excuse me. So the monitoring and reporting programs, there's a lot of variability from permit to permit in terms of what's in this section of your permit. It can be very simple. It can have as few as just influent and effluent monitoring required, although nowadays we often see recycled water added on to that in order to fulfill the volumetric annual reporting requirement from the state board. In addition to, larger dischargers or dischargers that aren't part of the RMP are going to have a much more complicated list of different monitoring locations to collect samples at. So this is an example that's more complicated. So for example, the Oceanside permit in San Francisco has more than 50 different monitoring locations listed within it. One nice thing that the regional board sometimes includes within your permit, either in the fact sheet or in the monitoring section, is a nice summary of all of the different monitoring requirements, because it can get complicated. And so if your permit does not have a nice summary table like this and you want one, then that's something that you could ask to be added to your permit. It's great when these are included, but that's not always the case. So here's just some examples. One that had a nice summary table of all the different monitoring locations and constituents, and then another example that has different reports that are due. Now, most of the time, all of the monitoring requirements are going to be found in attachment E of your permit. However, there are some cases where there may be monitoring and reporting requirements that are buried as part of a special study that might be listed as a provision in the front part of the permit. So don't forget to read the front part of your permit to look for potential monitoring and reporting projects that might be kind of like one-time only requirements in your permit. I feel like recently the regional boards have moved away from this approach and are not doing it as much, but it's something to be aware of. Unlike the front part of your permit, the legally enforceable part, which is really not possible to change, the monitoring and reporting program, if there's some sort of error in there, like a location is listed wrong or the units are wrong, it is possible to have these corrected by the regional water board staff. It's basically a compliance waiver for changing the monitoring and reporting program. So do reach out to your case handler if there's some sort of error that you think has occurred in your permit. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what happens during a permit reissuance. As I talked about, NPDES permits expire every 5 years. There is no way to get around that. And so this is going to be a calendar that's based on that 5-year reissuance cycle. So backing up from basically your new permit effective date or from the expiration date of your current permit, the reported waste discharge, which is the name of the application for reissuance, is typically going to be due anywhere from 6 to 12 months before the permit expires. The date that the application is due, the federal standard is 180 days, but some of the regional boards have put in earlier application deadlines onto the reported waste onto your permit. So it should say right on the front of your permit when your reported waste discharge is due. As long as you turn it in by that deadline, then your permit will be administratively extended. If for some reason the regional board can't adopt a new permit by the expiration date. So then you're covered legally. Your current permit will continue to be in effect. So definitely look at that application date right on the front of your permit. It should be right at the beginning. Now, in between these two dates, in between when you turn the application in and when the new permit's reissued, that is when you're going to be doing the negotiation with the permit writer and with the regional board staff regarding what's going to be in your permit. But that is too late of a time to determine what you actually need from your permit reissuance. You can't be using the negotiation period to figure out what it is you need. So what you want to do is figure out what you want in your reissued permit before you turn in the report of waste discharge. And that's a better time to actually talk to your permit writer, because that allows you to figure out what kind of technical documentation do you actually need to submit to the regional board in order to get the change that you seek. So for example, if you are going to be introducing an RO concentrate stream into your plant, maybe you're implementing potable reuse, you would need to fully describe that change in your permit application. And so you would want to reach out to your permit writer well in advance of when the application's due to check with them what kind of report would you like to see to handle any potential changes that need to happen to the permit. Make sure it's going to be in a format that they can use to prepare the reissued permit that has all of the language that you need to implement that change at your agency. This is a more straightforward way to get the changes implemented rather than trying to get your permit reopened and have those edits made, it is very difficult to get a permit reopened to have it changed during the 5-year permit cycle. It's just there's just not enough staff time at the regional boards to handle those requests, so they really do not like to receive them. They prefer for you to be very upfront about any potential changes that you might need within the next 5 years. It's better to get language added to your permit to cover a project that you might implement, even if you might not, than to count on a permit reopener. So again, I'm just trying to send the message that, plan well ahead of when your application is due. Said a different way, figure out your goals at least 6 to 12 months before the permit application is due. Like I said, talk to your permit writer and spend some quality time with your effluent and receiving water data so that you have a sense of whether you're going to need new effluent limits. You basically can do the reasonable potential analysis yourself. It's not that difficult to do a reasonable potential analysis. And also make sure you are in touch with your permit writer so that you know their schedule and are ready to review the draft permit when it comes out. In our region, we get administrative drafts with a 1-week turnaround period, which is very handy, but you have to be ready for it. And in all of the regions, there's a 30-day public comment period where you can still be negotiating the permit during that time frame if you weren't able to negotiate terms ahead of time. Okay, so I talked about a lot of rules for how permits are written. And the regional board doesn't have discretion in all areas, but there is flexibility possible in certain areas if you plan ahead. One of those areas for flexibility is mixing zones and dilution ratios. So, maybe you want to do a new mixing zone study or whether it's a field study or whether it's a modeling study. Those studies tend to take time, so you need to plan well ahead for those. Another area is monitoring frequencies. So everything in your monitoring and reporting program, usually attachment E, usually those requirements are not established in any kind of regulation. They're usually just customary based on the regional board that's issuing your permit. There are some exceptions to that, but it's potentially an area of negotiation. Another item would be adjusting water quality objectives for hardness, for translators, which translate dissolved objectives into total metals concentrations, and also water effects ratios that dictates the toxicity of metals. Those items are also areas where you might be able to do more receiving water monitoring or a special study that could result in a change to effluent limits. And then another final item where there may be flexibility is when you look at the water quality data, whether it's effluent or receiving water data that's used to develop water quality-based effluent limits. Sometimes there's certain periods of plant operation that are representative of the current plant, and sometimes perhaps you made a change to your plant operations and some part of the data set needs to be censored. So that's occasionally a consideration. And then if you need to make major changes to your permit, then you're going to be looking at doing an anti-degradation analysis, and that would allow the regional board to make some more significant changes, for example, to increase your permitted flow. The special studies that are required as part of your permit reissuance are also an area where there may be flexibility, both in terms of content and due dates. Okay, so to summarize, your permit's a mysterious document and it's full of illogical requirements, as you learned today, right? No, not really. Every requirement in your permit actually has a rationale that you can understand, and you are also can be an active participant in the permitting process by engaging with your permit writer. And that is the end of my presentation. Um, like I said, I posted a link to this in the chat, and it's also on the BACWA website, and there are some links to some of the documents that I mentioned today. And if you want to get more detailed training in this area, the EPA has a whole training video series for permit writers that will tell you everything you need to know to write your own permit or someone else's. And with that, I'm going to go back over to Q&A. Okay, how do they come up with the frequency for limits? For example, 6-week rolling geometric mean. Who develops those? So in that particular case, that objective was developed by the State Water Board, and it had a time period built right into it. So it kind of depends on where the objective came from. I'm sorry to say, it's going to depend on the objective, and it's going to depend on whether it sort of has implementation requirements that came with it. So, for example, the statewide toxicity provisions also not only have the objectives and the limits built into it, but the monitoring requirements are also built into that regulatory package. And so there's a minimum monitoring frequency as well. Some of the other objectives don't have that baggage that come with them. So all of the CTR constituents, for example, the minimum sampling frequency for those, if there's no effluent limit, is once per permit term. So there's not really a generic answer to that question, unfortunately. The next question is the SSO WDR part of the provisions? The WDR for sanitary sewer overflows is often mentioned within your NPDES permit, but it's actually a completely separate WDR. But I think what you're referring to is the fact that, yes, there is often a reference to the WDR that is actually not a provision, it's actually a prohibition. There's a prohibition on sanitary sewer overflows, basically, because you can't, that's a prohibition that says you can't discharge untreated waste. It's not covered by your NPDES permit. Oh, Jenny already answered it. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, is there a minimum time frame required before the permit application is submitted for our toxicity screening to be conducted? The answer to that is, I think, a specific question for Region 2. And within our, no, it's not a Region 2 question. I believe it's going to allow 18 months after the permit is reissued in order for you to do a toxicity screening to comply with the new screening, sorry, for the new TST style requirements coming from the state board. It doesn't actually need to be submitted before the application is submitted. Other regional boards may not take that approach, but I believe that's what our regional board is going to do. Where will the recording be posted? I'm going to try to post it to YouTube, but we'll put a link on the BACWA website. Could you go back to the resources slides, please? Yes. Heather Peterson, do you have a question or just wanted to see it? Thank you for reposting the slide, Samantha. Did I talk about infeasibility analysis? I did not talk about infeasibility analysis. It's not an area of deep expertise for me, but sometimes a situation arises where the regional board follows all of the procedures for looking at water quality objectives, establishing your effluent limits, and they come up with a number for your effluent limitation, and you cannot meet it. You know you can't meet it. No way. In that case, depending on the constituent and the situation, you may be either able to get a time schedule order that gives you time to come into compliance, or you may have a cease and desist order that also might have some tasks that allow you to come back into compliance. So basically, an infeasibility analysis would be an analysis that you do in order to kind of set yourself up to get more time to comply or to justify some alternate language in your permit. It's a little bit difficult to generalize beyond that. There's a comment from LA San that says, our permit requires an annual reasonable potential analysis. Cool, I did not know that. Any other questions? And I don't think I can see if anyone has their hand raised. I don't see any hands raised. Any final questions? Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. And thank you guys for coming today. And please reach out to me directly if you're a BACWA member and you have a question.